Xirtus. Okay, we're going to go over a lot of things really quickly, but maybe a really quick sum up before we start would be to say that things are not clearly marked in this world, especially surrounding the concepts of good and evil. And heroes and villains do not always dress like Disney characters. In fact, it would be in their self-interest to dress the opposite. That is to say, if they have a lot of good to do, to dress tough, and if they have any evil to do, to dress in the most socially acceptable way as possible in order to get away with it, through a sort of material ethical camouflage. And this is essentially how the elite are able to get so many of their goals done, aside from the craft itself, but also leads me into why it's so confusing about good and evil, and especially ethic in general, human ethic in the 21st century or any time. And it's at least interesting to consider how many evil people really love puppies, or the environment, or anything else. Because in the 21st century, arguably the postmodern age, there are no longer any rules which can be forced upon a person to define their character based on their social identity, and there are certainly no values which they can be obliged to uphold. They can now have their own values, which is interesting, but it also means that they don't need to have any values at all if they don't want. And that gets me into Shrek. And as weird as it might seem to bring up Shrek, if you think about Shrek for just a second, you can already see where this is going, probably. Not likely all the way. I mean, this spirals pretty deeply. But in general, Shrek is a very confusing piece of very popular children's entertainment.
Oh, really? You in what army?
Me? Why don't you go celebrate your freedom with your own friends?
But,
I don't have any friends. And I'm not going out there by myself. Hey, wait, I got a great idea. I'll stick with you.
You a mean green fight machine.
And Shrek's association with meme magic is notorious, although it's not very clear what the memes stand for.
Where have all the good men gone, and where are all the ghosts? Where's the streetwise Hercules to fight the rising moon? Isn't there a white knight upon a fiery steed? Late at night I toss and I turn and I dream of what I need.
I've come to have a pretty strange theory on Shrek, and I'm going to share it now. So let's go over some of the history of Shrek and things about Shrek, and the word Shrek itself, shall we? So starting with the German word Schreck, which can have to do with fright or being weak, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of Shrek is Max Schreck, an actor from early 20th century Germany who played Nosferatu, a film about vampires, sort of like Dracula, Of all vampire films, this is one of the most famous, even to this day. Now, the book Shrek by William Steig was written in 1989. William Steig was an American cartoonist whose parents were Polish-Jewish socialists who immigrated shortly after the pogroms. Accordingly, it would make sense that Steig was using the Yiddish version of the word Shrek, referring to fright or fear itself. Either way, it's hard for me to ignore the connection to Sethianism through the synchronic title of Michael Aquino's Fear Itself, book on psychic warfare and terror-based manipulation tactics, but also for his interest in Seth and chaos and darkness and space. In a very divorced from Christianity view, where essentially right and wrong are absent from the equation and power observed. I mean, tell me that's not the perfect definition of Shrek. It just makes a certain kind of sense. And the first time I saw Shrek, I was definitely too old to be in the theater with a bunch of crying babies and their confused, delirious parents trying to explain to the children what was going on the screen, as if these poor, desperate parents, who had clearly never been initiated into any esoteric schools themselves, as if they had any idea what Shrek was about. But in a sense, that chaos really cemented what the true meaning of Shrek really was, in terms of fear itself, but also in terms of humiliation and despair and pain and suffering, the sort of existential living hell of Camus. And another really weird thing, according to the New York Post, was that much of the team working on Shrek were DreamWorks animators who were being punished. Shrek itself, the production of Shrek, the ritual of the production of Shrek itself, was indeed, it sounds like, a form of torture. I mean, it took nearly a decade to create, after being optioned by Steven Spielberg immediately after the book was written, suspiciously. And originally intended for Bill Murray and Nick Cage, and capped at $20 million, the Shrek project degenerated, changing casts, changing artistic directions and scripts, and eventually completely re-recording the audio for Shrek with a completely new actor after the audio had been finished. The reason? The actor who was playing Shrek died. And this is another interesting story, that Chris Farley died right after finishing recording all of the audio necessary. At the time, this was considered a very sad drug overdose for a reckless and unhealthy actor. But as the years have gone by and we've learned more about the true nature of Chris Farley's life, including his donating time and hours to youth programs, his rather quiet faith life, his generosity, and quiet all-around decency, as well as the peculiar circumstances around his death and the synchronic dates which make speculation all the more provocative. However, after Chris Farley died, Mike Myers from Saturday Night Live was hired to replace him, and somewhat strange considering that all of the audio had been finished. Re-recording the audio with Seth Meyers meant months of extra work and millions of dollars. Also just throwing out much of the work that had been done before. Work that would have taken days and nights. No one would have seen it. And trust me, when you work hard on a project and Hollywood hides the rest from the world, it does seem like torture. But as if that wasn't enough, then near the end of the second recording of audio, when Mike Myers had nearly finished recording the entire audio for the second time, Mike Myers suddenly decided to try it with a Scottish accent, which then meant starting over again. However, with the soundtrack, Shrek made about $500 million in theaters and has made about $2 billion as a franchise. So I guess it was all worth the pain. Now, around similar timing to the Shrek book being written was also the apex of media daytime talk shows, particularly in this instance, Geraldo Rivera, who recently came under fire for complimenting the president when the president told the media that he knew Ghislaine Maxwell and wished her well. Geraldo went on to say that the cases for Ghislaine Maxwell are crimes allegedly committed more than 25 years ago. She deserved bail and got solitary confinement. Woke politics. And this is kind of interesting coming from Geraldo Rivera because in the 80s he was known for the daytime talk shows which interviewed the Satanists and also the heavy metal rock stars like Ozzy Osbourne who just liked the look. And a lot of people, especially the Christian right, thought that Geraldo Rivera was bringing very important attention to very important issues that had otherwise been shadowed out of the limelight. And that perhaps somehow this attention would bring forward real solutions for these issues, and that society would reject degeneracy. This is also because at the time, it was very common to blame Satanists for every kind of problem in the United States that happened in the night. And while I wouldn't say that all Satanists are free from committing crime, that a crime is committed by trusted people in power, and furthermore that evil people often dress nicely. And it would be foolish and against self-interest to draw attention to oneself while committing a socially unethical act. And that is to say, just because somebody looks evil doesn't necessarily mean they actually are evil. Just because somebody looks good doesn't mean they actually are good. And if things were as easy as judging people's outside appearance for their actions, then by now there would be no more crime left. And yet we keep hearing more and more about organized crime all over the world, which is in itself a sort of fear-based mind control. Oh, and another thing that would be worth bringing up is the Smash Mouth connection. Now, I'm not trying to say that Smash Mouth themselves, especially Steve Harwell, is necessarily a Satanist. I'm just saying a lot of the people I know who are Satanists particularly like Steve Harwell and Smash Mouth, which I've always found kind of strange and kind of interesting. Again, that proves nothing. I'm just saying I find it very interesting. Some of the high-ups love for Smash Mouth. I mean, that is pretty weird, but might as well be walking on the sun. And to be fair, Steve Harwell does have that sort of Saturnian look going on. But of course, it would make more sense not to say you were a Satanist, for a lot of reasons, not just because of the Church of Middle America. It's mainly because some things are better left unsaid. People have all sorts of hypnotic reactionary booby traps set up in their neurolinguistic programming, so sometimes it's easier to use a subconscious Trojan horse. And one of the more decent quotes from Steve Harwell that's not in one of his songs is, "I don't believe anyone's selling out," which might just sound like record company jargon, but if you think about selling your soul and what it really means, you can get a different picture about how someone has manifested themselves into Hollywood so successfully by selling their self. Or maybe he just sold his soul and he doesn't want to admit it. That also makes sense. But while I was thinking about Shrek and all of these things in Smash Mouth, all of a sudden I saw this article that came out just the other day. Smash Mouth performing for hundreds of people at a motorcycle rally over the weekend, and many guests weren't wearing masks. Apparently Steve Harwell said to F that COVID. So who knows what's going on with Steve Harwell. But I did think it was worth reiterating when he said, "I think there comes a time when you say, is this what we want, or is this what everyone else wants?" How's that for lyricism, eh? It could be just me, but it seems pretty clear what Smash Mouth is saying. And don't get me wrong, we're almost there. We just have to spiral back around the full loop. So before the next part, I think it's important to describe this as a synchronicity of relationships, which is such a general term that it's pretty impossible to ignore. For instance, this card from the Illuminatus game looks so similar to this famous meme from the television series Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Whether or not you think this was intentional seems irrelevant to the diabolical manipulative power of love. That is to say that everything is really defined by its relationship to everything else, and as Martin Buber said, the meaning of life is in encounters, life is in relationships. Rest in peace, Ryan Whitaker. May you have infinite lives in the Crash Bandicoot game in the sky. So, but then why would Geraldo bring up Satanism if he wasn't fully against it? And you can watch the entire special on YouTube, 2 hours of Geraldo Rivera. Go right ahead. But Geraldo interviewed some pretty interesting people associated with Satanism, including Anton LaVey and Anton LaVey's daughter, as well as Michael Aquino. And though he doesn't seem to come out fully as a supporter of the long-haired, radical subgenius side of the fight between good and evil, it would seem that he's a little soft on the principles of discordia. That is to say, he doesn't seem entirely against discord. And if anything, he seems to thrive off of it. In fact, there would be no Geraldo Rivera without discord, to make that clear. He's not remembered for the great documents he found inside of Al Capone's safe. There wouldn't be a plausible reason to have this guy around. He's remembered for having a cool and calm disposition when dealing with the completely absurd and socially unacceptable and unethical. But to many people, Geraldo Rivera is remembered as a sort of whistleblower, someone who outed the problems that were going on in the 90s, even if no resolution came. And therefore, I would ask you to watch Through the Black or Devil Worship Exposing Satan's Underground with Geraldo just to see my point, but I don't really get that vibe. If anything, it seems like a sort of apologist view to get the information laundered through the audience's ear. Like Anton LaVey himself, Geraldo Rivera helped legitimize the behavior of these socially unacceptable satanic characters, and even just make parents more comfortable with rock music and heavy metal. And going back and trying to see what other people's perspectives are, even looking at these modern articles from Wired Magazine, etc., show this kind of perspective, that Geraldo didn't stop Satanism. If anything, he really took it mainstream. And this sort of began the era of satanic vegetarians and socially acceptable goths, which hadn't been acceptable since the Jesuits, really. Yet all of a sudden, we're back. And in an era where the good and the bad have both failed, and the heroes and villains have let down the average character, suddenly all of these stereotypes about child molesters and trolls, they just weren't taught this next generation. And children were allowed an open mind, without any preconceived notions of irrational fears, or that's right, without the Shrek. And from the post-Shrek came the postmodern, and a lot of new kinds of ethic, including these vegetarian groups such as the Animal Liberation Front, the more militant sister group of PETA, but also simultaneously a deviation away from the Halloween-themed satanic church towards a more subgenius, secular deviation from ethic. And the subgenius church even praises Bob, Though never clearly represented as Robert Anton Wilson, it seems pretty obvious. Subgenius has nothing to do with intelligence, has nothing to do with race, nothing to do with education, has nothing to do with entertainment. It has nothing to do with skills or art, and nothing to do with humanity. Subgenius makes sense, has sense, sells sense, common sense, sense of humor, dollars, and cents. So I know that's just basically selling out, but tell me that doesn't sound exactly like something out of Steve Harwell's mouth from Smash Mouth. I mean, might as well be walking on the sun. It ain't no joke. And the principal discordia and subgenius culture have really permeated American culture and the world, where we have stepped into a full Straussian secularism, one that's not even aware that it's a faith-based religion based on empiricism. That is to say, the same perceptions and senses that they are taught to pervert. And there's certainly an amount of self-irreverence and sardonicism, but there's certainly some truth too. And there's definitely some solid faith amongst the subgenius. Whether they realize it or not, the beliefs in the nuclear future, in the shared instant with Bob, a sort of technological nospheric concept, but this is a sort of devotion to Saturn, which is older. But this new Americanized religion, and looking at the JFK assassination court files and about 15 minutes of audio recording about the connections between Lee Harvey Oswald and Carrie Wendell Thornley, the writer of The Principles Discordia and The Idle Warriors, a book which supposedly changed Lee Harvey Oswald's life, and it very least seemed like worth the court's time for 20 minutes to talk about. And up to this point, one of the weirdest things to talk about in the JFK assassinations. And remember, this is 1962, so this is still a pretty early time for America to find out about something so strange. I don't know if America was quite ready, but somehow we got by. And though similar in intention to the Temple of Set, the Temple of Set is clearly more enamored with the darkness than the chaos itself. To the Temple of Set, it seems that the darkness is a place of emptiness where the soul arises from, and this darkness, which is Seth, the masculine Seth, is essentially the feminine energy and the matrix and womb of consciousness and Mother Nature. But all of that's based on a lot of symbolism and presuppositions, so doesn't it make more sense to step away from it all and just sort of embrace Bob? After all, the almighty Bob is the Bob of the people, the subgenius people. So whether it means to or not, the subgenius church has really taken the Shrek metaphor. It's really been the doorway which opened up Shrekinism, Shrekanic thought, to manifest its full potential in the 21st century. But a little bit before the subgenius, and to be fair, as the sort of progenitor which made it possible, it's important to consider Anton LaVey and all of his efforts in making Satanism socially acceptable, if not only because he made some very interesting rules for his organization, specifically ones forbidding pedophilia. And there's an 11 basic satanic rules. It's important not to forget some of them are, if there's a guest in your lair who annoys you, treat them cruelly and without mercy, for instance. But in general, there's some pretty nice ones, like don't give your opinion unless you are asked, and don't harm little children, and do not make sexual advances unless you are given the mating signal. Also not to harm animals, unless you're not a vegetarian, which is also apparently fine. But rules like this, like for instance, not to break the law, because it's bad for one's self-interest, and in general, it would be bad for the face of the church. These are interesting rules because technically it would mean that if you were following Anton LaVey's church, you could not be a pedophile. Though certainly you could be in one of the fringe organizations. As a member of the church itself, absolutely not. How much you could trust Anton LaVey to be accurate about this, who's to say? But at very least, publicly, this is an interesting image for themselves. And the Church of Satan went around trying to provide as much PR as possible for positive Satanism and against any sort of witch hunts that were going on against the cultists in the United States. And that brings us to Xena. So the daughter of Anton LaVey, Xena, considered by many to be the first satanic toddler, though there surely were many before her, she was the most famous. Raised in the church, raised in the occult, raised in rituals, often involving sexuality and nudity and things probably not okay for a child to be a part of, at least to most other people. Eventually it seems like Xena came out of that, shall we say, dissatisfied with the relationship with her father, and she dropped the name LaVey in 1990. She hasn't responded to it since, not even receiving correspondences by mail, which include the name LaVey, fully divorcing herself from that symbol. And Xena to this day continues to counsel victims of extreme abuse, but she did not run off and become a Christian. Instead, it seems like she actually fulfilled the destiny like Krishnamurti. Oh yeah, earlier when I was saying that she was definitely not the first satanic toddler, and in fact, you might consider Krishnamurti to be more of the first satanic toddler, but there are definitely more satanic toddlers before that for centuries. God, look at France. Anyway, it doesn't really feel like Xena rebelled against the path she was taught. Far from it. It seems like she realized that the organization she was a part of was not an accurate representation of her faith, namely because the Church of Satan was a reactionary joke about Christianity, at least in title and in theme. But in practice, rather than oppose Christianity, the Church of Satan attempted to ignore Christianity through its theology and dogma, while constantly bringing attention to Christianity through its branding. This is the exact opposite of what Xena was brought up to believe. The intention for this very strange religion, very, very strange cult that her father had created, through often many lies as she found out, in order to essentially manipulate people and to build of all things for himself monetary wealth. Somebody brought up in this level of aesthetic mysticism, it just seemed material and shallow. Plus, every kid has to rebel against their parent, even if their parent's the devil, right? So Xena went off to find her own path, and this is pretty interesting because she did it more like Siddhartha, and in the process, rather than find someone else's path, maybe in credit to her satanic upbringing, rather than believe anyone else had the path, she believed that she had to find her own path and do what she willed. By the way, isn't this little goat thing surreptitiously adorable? And that's no accident either. Imagine the differences between today and in the 70s or the 50s. There was a time when the weird darkness of the occult seemed so foreign, but it didn't take too much time for the hippie movement to alter our perceptions of ethic and right and wrong, fully disintegrating the neo-colonial puritanic satanic culture and reinforcing our fears of the failures of these puritanical elite, of these puritanical sinners themselves, who often committed rape and murder, child abuse, and burnt often innocent people at the stake while enforcing their systems of abuse for generations. Some people had their hands cut off for working on Sundays. It would be hard to pretend that the Puritans were somehow perfect. It would also be hard not to notice that the first satanic churches of the United States are all from places in New England where the Puritans were the most strong. That's just an impossible coincidence. The two are surely correlated, leading us to the post-Aleister Crowley age, and somehow we went through this whole video without talking about Aleister Crowley, and thank God, because it's going to take forever to get into him, but evil spelled backwards is live, and the new generation looks at evil as some sort of existentialism. It actually is sort of a part of life, you have to commit evil in order to live. That's how it's being sold now. Righteousness is pushed to the side, is looked at as pale, and evil is looked at as a sort of vibrance. And so Xena left the Church of Satan and joined the Temple of Set, and later left Michael Aquino's Temple of Set to begin the Sethian liberation movement. Though now she considers herself a practical tantric Buddhist, Xena felt like her father never quite measured up to the man he was supposed to be, and she published a document very well sourced on many of the lies that her father had purported to be true about his background. Things like that his real name was Howard. I could easily do a Howard the Duck thing. I'm gonna save it for later. But go ahead and spiral off in your mind about how Anton LaVey is Howard the Duck. Go right ahead. And in looking for a man to replace her father, it seems like Xena found one, at least for a time, in a man named Nicholas Shrek. Surely not his real name, and he's made it very difficult to find out a lot about his past. And though after a little bit of digging I've found out his name and where he's from, it seems like a secret that he wants to keep kept, so be it. But Nicholas Shrek, along with the help of Xena, interviewed Charles Manson back in 1988, as well as 1989. The two worked together to create a documentary with the intention of sort of socially redeeming Charles Manson, who'd been blamed for the Tate murders, when in real life he had been nowhere near the Tate murders, and even the idea that his propaganda was entirely responsible for them seems a little dodgy. And in fact, Charles Manson might better be described today as some sort of an eco-fascist. And you really have to wonder how Charles Manson would have been accepted in the 21st century, as opposed to back in the 60s, when the world was still just getting ready for trolls and had no idea what was to come. Charles Manson had made some pretty interesting music and had been recorded by Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys. He's got at least 3 or 4 completely listenable songs. Like Look at Your Game Girl is amazing.
Are those feelings real? Look at your game, girl.
I've got a curiosity. Can I ask you a question? Mm-hmm. Remember you had an X years ago and you changed it now to a swastika?
No, I never changed. It's been the same thing all the way along. I put that there from 2 or 3 other symbols. I didn't want to put a Christian symbol, and I didn't want to put an Antichrist symbol, and I didn't want to put a pro-communism. And
that would be Germany, wouldn't it?
No, that's not a Nazi. Hitler got that sign from mysticism and reversed it. He did the same thing, only he did it backwards. It's the thought still here, just like the thought that he picked up was there when he picked it up. The thought has always been here. It's been here since the pyramids have been here, since David and the giant since the whole thing's always been here. And every once in a while, there's a guy like Magandhi that comes and picks it up. Or there's a guy like Paharasha Yogananda, or somebody coming out of some prison, or somebody doing something, and they pick it up for a while, and they carry it for a few steps, and then when they're gone, you say, oh, what a good guy he was. But while he's here, he's always just no good at all, you know.
And it's a little nuts to watch Nicholas Shrek's documentary with Charles Manson, because the interview will leave you at points wondering about Charles Manson, though sometimes it's obvious that the man is sane, definitely somewhat spun out. But you can't pretend that every single thing that he says makes absolutely no sense. And his continued lack of parole for a crime that technically he did not commit is pretty interesting historically. However, so Xena renounced the progenitor's name, and she became Xena Shrek, in a perfect move of Sethian liberation, embracing, as Aquino had called it, fear itself, and becoming, instead of an angel or a demon, a sort of troll, definitely opening the doors and beginning the waves of Shrekanism, arguably the most socially acceptable clandestine religion, a ritual craft faith detached from ethic entirely, replaced by a religious moral that is essentially pure secularism, to consider how removing right and wrong from the equation makes it easier to control people, especially sexually. Related from this week, the troll doll that they're removing from shelves that Hasbro had put a clitoral button on the bottom of. You know, a button between the troll's legs that make her laugh. And some say that this promotes child abuse, and others, probably rather secular others, view this little doll as an icon to sex-positive feminism and a sort of conduit to the liberation of feminine sexuality through this toy's functionalism, which simply provides a window into human sexuality without a lens of right or wrong. The thing is, there really are consequences to what a child sees and wrestles with in their psyche. I mean, besides performing her Buddhist music rituals, the fact that Xena spends so much time counseling so many survivors and victims of abuse should already say something about the mind of a child and of a daughter, and of anyone involved with any cult. Incidentally, I kind of think that Charles Manson in Shrek is Donkey. I mean, hear me out. If you look at some of the quotes from Charles Manson, that he was an ass, that his philosophy is not to think, I'm more and more convinced that Donkey represents the wild part of humanity, the wild human without good and evil, which Shrek found so inspirational. So in terms of Xena's perspective of the divine feminine, her quote here, the Gnostics' passionate adoration of Sophia was known as philosophia, the love of Sophia, a mystical communication with divine feminine wisdom, having little to do with the strictly intellectual and most often masculine pursuit currently labeled as philosophy. I think that sort of sums up the problems with most religions anyway, but also shows the difference in a spiritual internal pursuit as one involved with religious hierarchies, similar to Michael Aquino's Temple of Set. Contrarily, the Sethian liberation movement had no such titles and focused more on the happening and focused more on the crafting of the happening that Xena considered themselves mutually to be a part of. I say that past tense because eventually they did get divorced. And in considering the difference between God and the devil, or the gods or the goddesses, it's important to consider the Gnostic concepts such as Abraxas, a word of mystic meaning, in the system of the Gnostic Basilides, being there applied to the Great Archon, or the Magus Archon, the Princeps of the 365 spheres. The word is found in Gnostic texts such as the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit, and also appears in the Great Magical Papyri. It was engraved on certain antique gemstones, called on that account the Abraxas stones, which were used as amulets or charms, as the initial spelling on the stones was Abrasax. The spelling of Abraxas today probably originates in confusions made between the Greek letters sigma and chi in the Latin transliteration. The 7 letters, however, might represent each of the 7 classic planets, and the word might be related to abracadabra. There are similarities and differences between such figures and reports about Basilides' teachings in ancient Gnostic texts and larger Greco-Roman magical traditions in modern magical and esoteric writings. Speculations have proliferated on Abraxas in recent centuries, who has largely been claimed to be both as an Egyptian god and demon. But the world certainly has changed from the way it was back then. If Charles Manson were being accused of similar crimes, this is the picture the media would probably use of him. And not to act like he's entirely vindicated just by saying some words, but it's interesting. But there's been a number of theories that people performing ritual sacrifices used and exploited Charles Manson, scapegoating him in order to get away with their blood magic. Charles Manson is noted as saying, if I wanted to, I could have done this, but I did not do this, and you're crazy, you're making me famous. Also, more clearly, Charles Manson said, "I've killed no one, I've ordered no one to be killed. These children who come to you with their knives, they're your children. I did not teach them, you did." It does make you kind of wonder a bit about the official narrative of a guy who, again, never actually killed anybody, but a guy who was also fed tons of psychedelic research chemicals by the military for time off from petty crimes at Folsom Jail. How's that for your god and demon Abraxas? Well, there's a lot of newer issues going on today that we could consider how they affect us, such as the relationship back from SETI to Jeffrey Epstein, who himself hoped to seed the human race with his own DNA. Something that doesn't seem too entirely different from what Keith Raniere was doing with Allison Max and Nexium. But there's so much to consider and so much past to go over that it's almost better to leave it there so we can focus on the future. Because if there's one thing that we've learned from history, it's that the future is so bright.